Hello everyone and welcome. So for today's lesson, we're going to continue discussing the invisible or symbolic confrontations of the Cold War, this time really looking at the American psyche. What's being experienced by the American public throughout this confrontation. You'll delve much more into this in United States history too. Just keep in mind as we move through this, we're really going to be taking a thematic approach and looking at different moments. In US history too, it will be much more chronology based. For today's lesson, please title your notes The Red Scare. So, the period of the Red Scare is all about the growing anxieties in the American public. So, you'll see by the end of today's lesson just how horrifying it really was to live through the early Cold War in particular, and basically face this constant threat of a nuclear attack or invasion by the Soviet regime. So we talked about propaganda earlier in the year. It's been used all throughout history for a very specific purpose to sway the opinions of the public. In the United States during the Cold War, an organization called the Civil Defense Administration is going to be created essentially to pump out propaganda to the public, delivering warnings about the real threat that the Soviet government posed to the US. So, probably the most famous example of Cold War propaganda are the famous duck and cover videos and images, like the one that you're seeing over there to the left. It's possible that your grandparents may have seen them as children, but essentially the idea was children were prepared to duck and cover in the event of an atomic or nuclear attack on the country. The idea is that, as you can see, Bert the Turtle, who is the mascot of these films, is smart because he gets down really quickly, hides in his turtle shell, and therefore, because he is ducking and covering, he will be safe. In reality, of course, you would be incinerated instantly if an atomic bomb landed on you, but kids are going to practice these in schools just the same way that you practice like code grade drills in high school today. Again, this is all about reminding citizens of the constant threat of communism, of the Soviet regime. This is tied to the idea of total warfare. Essentially, you're mobilizing civilians, mobilizing kids. In this, basically, you're training them to believe that they are also soldiers on the front lines in this conflict. Just to show you a short bit of this, you're seeing here Bert the Turtle is safe because he duck and covers in his shell, whereas the foolish monkey who is out in the open is instantly incinerated by dynamite. A really horrifying image for children, really, if you think about it, for sure. In some populated areas, kids would also wear dog tags around their necks as well. Again, a symbolic show that those kids are soldiers in this war against communism. The official reason was that if there actually was an attack, you would be able to identify the bodies of the kids. It would have their names and addresses on them. But of course, the real reason is to provoke fear, to scare the public, to constantly remind them of the reality of the Cold War. So in terms of what is the purpose of Cold War propaganda truly, it's all about total warfare and truly mobilizing civilians. Just to show you a few different examples, many propaganda posters will become prevalent at the time. In this one, you're seeing, "Is this tomorrow?" The American flag is burning in the background as men wearing Soviet attire are murdering American citizens. Here you're seeing Uncle Sam and the United States heading toward an iceberg, very Titanic-like in style, and you can see that all of the countries that have already been impacted by the Soviet Union, China, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, East Germany, North Korea, all these places in Eastern Europe are now tombstones because they've been absolutely destroyed by communism. Also, in movies and television shows, this fear of communism is going to be very prevalent as well. This one is titled, "I Married a Communist." A woman marries someone who is actually a commie, and she doesn't realize it until it's too late, and realizes that he's, of course, plotting against the United States. This will be unpopular in comics as well. And this one, Superman has been brainwashed by the Soviet Union. And he says, sorry, comrade, it's true. It's truth, justice, and the Soviet way now. In this comic panel, it's kind of hysterical, but an American family is watching the television only to realize that the U.S. has been taken over by the Soviet Union. You can see the American flag has the hammer and sickle symbol on it over here, and they, of course, have to rush off to church to pray to find out what they should do next, only to find that their church has also been taken over by the government because the communist government owns everything. Left with no representatives to write to, they are forced basically to sit on their hands and accept that their American values have been destroyed. Popular films like The Red Menace will become popular, so kids and teenagers will go and see this in the cinema. Kids will find wrappers like this in their bubble gum. Can you collect them all? This one is called Ghost City. It looks very New York City-like, but instead of a picturesque summer day, you are seeing a nuclear wasteland. Grim Reaper is in the clouds as it looks like everyone has been killed by a nuclear blast. Can you collect Mao Zedong, the war maker, the person who has destroyed China with his communist ideologies and looks very sinister? And you can see it looks like an ape or ape-like figure wielding a machete covered in blood. So this fear of communism is going to prompt a movement called McCarthyism. You may have heard of this before, but essentially it starts a communist witch hunt in the country where people are terrified of communism and people start being accused of being communists left and right, most notably people within our own government. It's going to be spearheaded by a senator named Joseph McCarthy. It's actually going to be the event that Arthur Miller is going to write his famous play, The Crucible, about. The play is about the Salem witch trials, but it's really an allegory for the communist witch hunt at the time, where people are accused of being pink down to their underwear. People are accused of being a little bit red, and therefore should be investigated for it. Of course, most of the people being accused were not actually communists at all, but it's going to stir fear even more so in the country. Ultimately, more and more people start being accused of being communist. And as more renowned people and more well-known people are accused, the witch hunt itself actually dies out, and Joseph McCarthy is largely disgraced. It's actually the same thing that happens during the Salem witch trials, which you'll learn about next year. As more notable, upstanding members of the community are accused of witchcraft in Salem, the witch trials similarly die out. So in 1953, Joseph Stalin suffers a stroke in his bedchambers in the Soviet Union, and the next leader of the Soviet Union becomes Nikita Khrushchev. We're going to talk about a couple different leaders throughout the Cold War. Again, just keep in mind this is several decades passing throughout this chapter, so it might feel like we're moving through it very quickly. You'll go into a lot more detail in U.S. history too. So just to kind of keep us in terms of chronology, first we're going to be talking about Truman. So this is right after World War II, and then we'll be moving on from there. Okay. So after the atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it begins an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. So in 1945, immediately the U.S. and USSR are going to begin building long-range rockets. These are called ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Essentially, they can travel from one continent to the other. The idea behind it is that these missiles can penetrate the atmosphere, essentially go into outer space, re-enter, and then hit their target. A truly horrifying proposition that the Soviet Union could deliver a nuclear explosion from their own country. In the case of the atomic bombing of Japan, the US literally had to fly the bombs over them. If these missiles are successful, it could literally cause the apocalypse in a matter of hours. You'll see once we cover the Cuban Missile Crisis that the American public has to face this in a very real way. So, in 1949, the USSR detonates an atomic weapon to show off their strength to the US. So, of course, Truman wants to develop an even more powerful weapon, and that comes in the form of the hydrogen bomb, basically a device that would cause a blast 10 times as powerful as the atomic bombs that were used on Japan. The US is going to test theirs in 1951. The USSR will test theirs in 1952, right before Joseph Stalin dies. So, just transitioning forward a little bit, after Truman, Dwight David Eisenhower, the general during World War II, will become the next U.S. president. One of the most popular men to ever serve in office. He was actually asked to run both by the Democrats and the Republicans. He ultimately runs as a Republican. So, during his administration, he sends his vice president, Richard Nixon, to travel to Moscow to meet with Nikita Khrushchev. So they meet at what's called the American National Exhibition, which is like a series of presentations and exhibits showing all that's possible in the United States because of their technology, of course, driven by capitalism. So the two world leaders debate the merits of their own economic ideologies. Nixon talks about capitalism, Khrushchev talks about communism, and of course, it's televised in both countries, so people are watching these debates taking place live. Nixon shows Khrushchev a model American kitchen. He shows him a refrigerator, a mixer, a washing machine. He argues that any American citizen can afford these things. Of course, that's not necessarily true at the time. But again, it's really showing off what's possible with capitalism. And of course, showing the people in countries that might potentially fall to communism in the future why capitalism is so much better. Again, the Cold War is all about symbolic confrontations. This is not the Soviet Union and the US going to war or fighting with each other. These are debates looking at what each other's countries have to offer. Just to show you some pictures, here you can see Richard Nixon and Khrushchev looking at a model American kitchen and a washing machine, and here you're seeing a demonstration of appliances made by a presenter. So one of the most infamous symbolic confrontations between the USSR and US comes in the form of what's called the space race. So the US and the USSR begin racing basically to the stars. There's little point to the space race other than bragging rights at first. You might argue that it's in the name of science, but it's really about surveillance. It's really about scaring the other side. So it's actually the Soviet Union that's the first to achieve putting a satellite in space in the form of Sputnik 1. Imagine the dread and fear of the American public in the Midwest looking up to the skies and seeing the blinking Soviet satellite flying over their heads, not knowing if they're being watched, if they're on camera, a truly terrifying thing for the Americans at the time. So, of course, you'll see headlines like this: Russians win race to launch Earth satellite. This will prompt other flights in the future. Sputnik 2, the first dog to be in space. This is a really interesting primary source to consider. You're going to talk about this a lot next year in United States History 1, but it's an important parallel or like synthesis point to draw. So this is from an American professor in 1893. So this is years and years earlier, but it ties into what we're talking about in the Cold War. So he writes, up to 1880, the United States had a frontier of settlement, but now the unsettled area has been so broken that there can hardly be seen as a frontier line at all. This officially marks the closing of a great historic movement. Up to now, American history has been in a large degree the history of colonization of the Great West. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. So the question becomes, really, what is Frederick Jackson Turner saying here about the American experience? He says it's all about exploration. It's all about exploring. In U.S. History 1, you talk about westward expansion, moving into the middle part of the country, and essentially manifest destiny taking over the continent. But Turner's arguing after 1880, there's no more frontier. So he wonders if the great American experiment, if the United States will continue to be as great as it had always been up to that point. And this idea is going to reemerge in the 1960s under the administration of John F. Kennedy. So JFK is going to win the election of 1960 versus Richard Nixon. Nixon will later become president 2 administrations later, so he will come back, of course. But JFK makes his campaign slogan and his domestic agenda called the New Frontier. basically arguing that yes, the old frontier, the American West, is gone, but now the United States has a new frontier to strive for. This one in outer space. In a 1961 speech, 2 years before his assassination, JFK sets a goal of having a man on the moon by the decade's end. And really symbolically, having a man on the moon kind of becomes like the end goal of the space race. Whoever can get a man on the moon first really kind of becomes like the quintessential winner. Um, JFK's assassination in November of 1963 only further inspires the US public to ultimately reach his goal. So, in terms of other achievements, the Soviets have the first man to orbit the Earth. Americans have the first man in space. The Soviets have the first woman in space. And then ultimately it culminates with the lunar landing, with the Apollo 11 actually touching down on the moon itself. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first men to walk on the moon in 1969. And again, really symbolically, them planting the American flag on the moon in the eyes of the United States becomes the US winning the space race. So we're going to wrap up here today. We've covered a couple different symbolic moments during the Cold War. Going forward, we're going to talk about when the Cold War actually becomes hot in the form of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then ultimately we'll talk about the two actual proxy conflicts, the Korean War and the Vietnam War.